Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So we're continuing on with ideas, video 8, part 3, procedure of pure phenomenology, blah blah blah. Chapter 2, general structures of pure consciousness. In this video, this chapter is going to run 2 videos. I tried to squeeze it into one, but that just wasn't happening. So we're going to go for 2 videos. So let's jump into it with the first thing that I want to do before I kind of divide the video. There are 2 main sections of this video today. But before we do that, there's kind of a little review section at the beginning, which is always good to go through as well, just to keep us on track. So Husserl talks about the way that the phenomenological reduction has brought us now to the realm of transcendental consciousness, or absolute being. Absolute because it is the original category of being in which all other regions of being have their root, to which they are essentially related, and on which they are therefore one and all dependent in an essential way. So we're at this level of we're in this realm which all other kinds of being, everything that all objects, all experiences, all acts refer to this original primordial being, hence the absolute being. And the distinction here then is between being as consciousness and being as declaring itself in consciousness. And we've talked about that distinction before. That's just the distinction between, Husserl gives it another name here, a distinction between the transcendental and transcendent being. And we've encountered this division under the name immanent and transcendent. So just more words, more terms that mean the same thing, that this kind of division between the immanent and transcendent. But that was kind of an interesting use of the word, I thought, transcendental, to be the realm of absolute being. Worth remembering that, I think, and as opposed to transcendent being, which is that the being of objects that present themselves through that mode of the Abschattung, the different appearances that they have, that we can only know about them through that way of knowing, as opposed to the immanent, which we take in as a whole, at a grasp. So that's just a little revision. He reminds us that the reduction is a bracketing, not an elimination. So we're just suspending the natural world. We're not eliminating it. We're not denying it. We're not getting rid of it completely. So after bracketing the natural world, it's then possible to have a phenomenology of the natural scientific consciousness and nature itself. And after bracketing psychology, we can have a phenomenology of human beings and their personalities and that kind of thing. And after bracketing sociology, we can still have a phenomenology of the mind, of the community, of social institutions, of cultural creations. So phenomenology still applies even after the bracket, because we're not eliminating those fields. We are just suspending them to uncover, to move into this realm of transcendental being, transcendental consciousness. And so that then, the phenomenology, those kinds of phenomenological investigations that Husserl was just talking about, are obviously where Heidegger chose to focus his attentions, and everybody who followed on from him. And so that's kind of the split between Husserl and Heidegger. Heidegger just rejected that transcendental leap and kept everything in the natural world. There was nothing else. There was no extra transcendental realm for him. And And yeah, so that's just kind of interesting to see that crop up as well. All right, the first part of the video then, the first official section today is reflection. So the phenomenological method proceeds entirely through acts of reflection, Husserl says, which makes sense, right? Because that we're investigating the structures of consciousness itself, how consciousness operates, what is involved, what's entailed in this transcendental realm of absolute being. So reflection is going to be the only tool, not just the best tool, but the only tool we have. And so a part of phenomenology is then going to be a systematic study of reflection itself, what reflection is, and the different types or modifications that reflection undergoes. So all reflection is a modification of consciousness. It's basically a turn from an unreflective disposition to a reflective one, where we're not aware of what it is that we are, how it is that consciousness is doing what it's doing when we're in the midst of having experiences, but we can take this step back and bring that to light. We can focus on what it is consciousness is doing. And Husserl always says that is something which is essential, and not in the sense of really important, but essential in the sense that it's a part of what it is for these conscious experiences to be conscious. It's a part of that we can direct our focus from the objects themselves to the way that consciousness is constituting those objects, the way that consciousness is bestowing meaning on those objects, how it's creating those objects for us. It's a part of the essential nature of consciousness in the sense of eidetics. It's part of what it is for consciousness to do the things that it does, that we can direct our glance away from the objects that we're caught up in to how it is that those objects are appearing. And that's what reflection is doing. And that's what I've just written here. Next, it's possible for every experience to become an object for consciousness. Or, as Husserl says here, and sometimes he uses the word quite a lot here, pure ego in this chapter. To become an object for pure ego. So every experience itself becomes an object. We're not just, it's not the objects that we are focusing on, the objects that we're caught up in our living. Now we're turning our attention from that to the experience of those objects, how consciousness is. I'll use the word because it's the word that Husserl uses, constitutes those objects. And in addition, these reflections themselves can be reflected upon, becoming objects for further reflection. So there's kind of a nesting situation here where we're aware of the objects, then we're aware of the consciousness itself through this mode of reflection, and we can bring the mode of reflection itself and investigate that. We can turn our attention to that and see what's involved, how reflection itself works. So that there's plenty of meat here to get into. And he starts by talking about reflection, by looking at experience through reflection, but experience from within the natural standpoint. So we start here and we see that as experience appears as really lived, as being now. So there's that sense of present, the moment, present moment. It's really lived as being now. But at the same time as we're aware of that, and this is still from the natural viewpoint, we're also aware of this experience as just having been. That is to say, existing, even though we weren't reflectively aware of this. So we weren't actually paying attention to it just before, but we know that the experience was going on. We know that just as I reflectively turn my attention towards this experience, it doesn't just pop into being at that moment. We know that it already existed prior to my attention, prior to my reflection. I just wasn't paying attention to it. I wasn't reflectively aware of it. And this is what Husserl calls retention. And this is going to be an important part of his time, his notion of time. So this is retention, and it's not memory. We've got to be careful not to conflate this with memory in the sense of recall, but he calls it a primary memory. And basically all it is it's the way that the past retains some sense of presence in the present moment. So it's not lost completely. The past doesn't disappear completely once the new present comes along. The past is retained, hence retention, retained in that present moment. If it weren't, our lives would be completely impossible. Would be completely wrapped up, absorbed in the present moment. Would be completely ahistorical. There'd be no historical reference for us to understand what's going on. Life would just be completely meaningless. So we have these retentions of these past nows, really. And this is, again, still in the natural standpoint. But in addition to this, experience also appears as presently coming. And that is about to exist, even though, again, we weren't reflectively aware of this either. And this is the opposite of retention. This is protension. And again, as retention wasn't memory, protension is not expectation. It's the word he uses here is prevision to distinguish it from expectation, because it's not a reflective awareness of the future. It's I guess we could say it's the future as lived. We're engaged in the moment with this horizon of something presently coming, and this other horizon on the other side of the just having been, and that's how all of our experiences appear to us. We're not locked into this moment, which is the only truth, and everything else is an illusion, or everything else it only becomes real when we direct our attention to it. We're in this moment that spans the past and the future. So he doesn't use those words, the words that we usually use to describe the tenses of time, past, present, and future, because they don't apply. It's a completely different way of thinking about time. We're not actually thinking about time. We're thinking about how our experience takes place, what our experience is in that moment, in the act of experiencing. Every experience has these retentions and these protensions built into it, and we're not reflectively aware of it. We're living we're living this present moment. We're living the retentions and the protensions rather than reflecting on them. However, we can turn the retentions and the protensions into explicit reflective acts if we represent, with a hyphen is how Husserl uses this word. We can explicitly represent these retentions and protensions in consciousness, and that's when they become recall as a memory and anticipation as an expectation of something to come. And these again are explicit reflective acts which reproduce, hyphenated, which reproduce the original retentions and protensions, now in a reflective mode. And that's the natural standpoint. So we haven't even affected the epoche yet. So that's the next step. Now we enforce the reductions. We bracket out the natural world. And so what do we get? Established results within their bracket are transformed into cases that illustrate essential generalities. And we can now make them our own within the framework of pure intuition and sympathetically study them. For instance, in vivid intuition, imaginative if you like it, we picture ourselves as involved in this or that act. We perform all the reductions and see what lies in the pure essential nature of the phenomenological material. And the reason I threw that quote in is just, it's a nice description of how the reduction works. A kind of distancing oneself from the act, from being caught up, engaged in the act itself. So we effect this reduction, and Husserl then looks to see, so now we've done that, what does reflection tell us about these experiences? His example is joy. So what we're looking for now is, once we've done performed the reduction, now we're looking for essential generalities. Now we're looking for the things that go beyond the concrete individual instances to give us an understanding of the essence of conscious experience. And so his example is joy, and we imagine ourselves, that is to say, we reflect on ourselves in an act of joy. And what do we get? It appears as present again, so that there are some parallels here between what we saw with our reflections from within the natural standpoint, but now just kind of at a higher level, at the level of transcendental being here. So the experience still appears as present, but as a going concern, he describes it. Previously experienced, but not held before the eye. And so again, this is like the unreflective nature of experience within the natural standpoint. And so what we can do now then through reflection is look back into this past duration of the experience and see what we can discover from that act. And we note that the lack of a glance directed towards the joy while we were in the midst of it. So there was no focusing on the joy itself, on the experience of the joy itself, when we were actually experiencing it. And this brings us back to that mode of unreflecting consciousness. Same kind of thing that we saw in the natural standpoint, just now at the level of the experience itself, not the object, not the actual individual object within the natural standpoint. We can also note the act of reflection itself that objectified the joy And we can do that in order to render more effectively clear the difference between what is experienced but not noticed and the joy that is noticed. So we can pay attention to the reflection itself that brought the experience of joy before us. And that just makes it clearer for us what it is to reflect on the experience of joy and to actually experience the experience of joy. And we can also think about the modifications that the act of reflection brings about in consciousness. How is consciousness modified? How does it get changed through this act of reflection, bringing the experience itself into focus? We can also note all the possibilities of intentional aspects of experience within the mode of unreflecting consciousness, as well as the intentional aspects of the experiences of the modified consciousness, modified through reflection. Further, we can note and this again is another parallel back to what we saw in the natural standpoint, our reflections on that. We can note the having been perceived that lies in memory. So now, similar to, but again, at a higher level from the retention that we talked about earlier, the retention that we looked at before was the awareness of the specific object or event or experience in the past, that having been. But now we're turning our attention to the experience itself, the experience of the past object's pastness. It's what Husserl calls it's having been perceived, as opposed to the having been of the retention that we looked at before. So the same kind of thing, just at a higher level. Instead of the having been of retention, we're now looking at the having been perceived of the experience in the first place. And the same thing holds for the protensions, the about to be perceived aspect that lies in expectation, parallel with the retention, with the protensions of the natural standpoint. So all of that comes through when we use reflection to understand, to bring to light these what consciousness is doing in constituting these experiences for itself, how these experiences are appearing for consciousness. And then to finish this section on reflection, because I've written H, I've got H here for Husserl, but I did the same for Heidegger when I did those videos. So I always just instinctively go straight to Heidegger. Anyway, Husserl discusses an objection here that's been made at him, at his idea, his phenomenology, by H.J. Watt. I have no idea who that guy is, but the essence of the objection is he's saying that self-knowledge, this kind of reflective approach, is unreliable because, strictly speaking, it's neither knowledge nor an object of knowledge. Reflection, reflecting on the self, it's not actually knowledge because it's yourself, but it's not an object of knowledge either because, again, it's yourself. There's nothing external for you to be paying attention to, for you to be focusing on. So it's unreliable, he thinks. And so he says the reality of the pure ego is lived and never known. It's lived, but it can never be known. And what's interesting actually is that Bergson and Merleau-Ponty also make a similar argument, but not in the form of an objection, against Husserl. And Husserl's response to this is that all skepticism relies on the very thing it claims to be skeptical about. So he says, he who merely says, I doubt the significance of reflection for knowledge, maintains an absurdity. For as he asserts his doubt, he reflects. And to set this assertion forth as valid presupposes that reflection has really and without a doubt the very cognitive value upon which doubt has been cast, that it does not alter the objective relation, that the unreflective experience does not forfeit its essence through the transition into reflection. And that's pretty solid, I think. I think that's a pretty good argument there. Basically, Watt can't refute reflection. He can't deny or doubt it because his own claims are based on reflection. He's reflecting on himself all the time, just in making the assertion. He's using reflection to make his skeptical claim. And so that's, I think, a pretty good response. And I would just throw in here as well that Bergson and Merleau-Ponty weren't arguing against Husserl, but they also weren't skeptical about the use of reflection. They both endorsed the use of reflection, but the point they were making was that they were arguing against the way that the intellect represents things to itself. So when we reflect, we're engaged with the intellect. We're thinking in kind of that third person perspective, that scientific approach, logical, conceptual, using categories of the understanding, all things that are designed or evolved even to let us function in the world. And that means that those very tools are not the tools we can use to understand the world itself. They're operative within the world and on things that are in the world, but then that means, by definition, they're not going to be equipped or they're not capable of understanding the world itself as a whole, which won't just be another thing like the things in the world that the intellect is capable of dealing with. So their arguments were not that reflection's no good, but that we have to use reflection wisely. We have to use it carefully. And that's basically what Husserl's saying here as well. So nice, they merged there. The second part of today's video is the pure ego. All right, so we're coming back to the pure ego again. We've already talked about this before. There is a lot of repetition. I've kind of noted that before, but each repetition brings a little bit more clarity, I think. It approaches the topic from a slightly different direction, first of all, there is repetition of ideas, which is I'll never complain about that in these kinds of texts, because it just lets you see the same thing from a different angle, through different words, through different expressions, after having learned about some other stuff. So you come to it kind of afresh with a new take as well. It solidifies things that we've already grasped, or we thought we grasped, or we hadn't grasped. It just helps bring everything into focus a bit. And also, like I said, each repetition adds something. It expands on what we did know before. So yeah, there is repetition, but I will never complain about that in these texts. So the pure ego: in every act I am present. I'm actually present. And in reflection, I apprehend the human being that I am. So that's the natural standpoint. Okay, so we're starting again from that natural standpoint, reflecting on the natural standpoint. We see that the I, which is there, is always there. It's always actually there, and it's an I as human being, as that empirical ego subject that we've talked about before. The psychological subject, I think, is the psychological ego subject. That's what we called it. So now again we effect the reduction. We bracket out the natural world. The world disappears along with I, the person. So I, the person, that empirical ego subject, disappears, is bracketed, suspended. And the pure experience as act with its own proper essence then remains as residue. No disconnecting can remove the form of the cogito and cancel the pure subject of the act. The being directed towards, the being busied with, adopting an attitude, undergoing or suffering from, has this of necessity wrapped in its very essence, that it is just something from the ego, or in the reverse direction to the ego. And this ego is the pure ego, and no reduction can get any grip on it. And so, yeah, we've talked about that before, right? We talked about that in the video on the reductions. Every cogito, every conscious act, every act of consciousness is characterized as act of the ego, capital E ego, that pure ego, or proceeding from the ego. That's always built into every act, every cogito. And there isn't really anything extra to say about that, I think. We've kind of said everything we need to. But what was interesting in this section, that he hadn't mentioned before that I remember, is this. The experiencing ego is still nothing that might be taken for itself and made into an object of inquiry on its own account. Apart from its ways of being related or ways of behaving, it is completely empty of essential components. It has no content that could be unraveled. It is in and for itself indescribable. Pure ego and nothing further. So I thought that was really interesting. It's completely empty of content. There is nothing to the ego, to the pure ego. It's purely a, how did I describe it back in that last video? It's like, I forget actually, like an orientation, I think, an orientation of the field of consciousness. It orients the field of consciousness in a certain direction. It gives it a valence that is centered on me, that is centered on this point around which that is centered around this point, which is me, which is this pure ego. But again, the pure ego itself doesn't have any content. It's not. There are no qualities we can associate with it. It doesn't have a personality. None of those things. It's just an orienting of the field of consciousness around this focal point, and that's the pure ego. But yeah, empty of content. Cool. And impossible to read that and not think of Sartre, right? The for itself as nothingness, consciousness as nothingness. So I thought that's an important and interesting link to throw in. And even though every experience necessarily has this pure ego behind it, or wrapped up in it, Husserl continues to distinguish between the two. And I remember saying that in the video on the reductions as well. yeah, we are treating them as separate, even though there is no experience without a pure ego associated with it. We're just investigating them separately, like I said at that time, just so we can more clearly understand both. But as I said, they go together. They come together essentially. They're essentially wrapped up together. Okay. I'm just sometimes I get caught into those loops, just start looping around the same thing again and again. That's kind of interesting. Anyway, that's the end of the material that I wanted to look at today. So let's have a quick summary. First, we looked at reflection. This is the first structure of consciousness that we are analyzing, and we saw that it is a modification of consciousness. If we turn reflection towards the experience of empirical objects, so that is within the natural standpoint, we get this picture of the lived now, with those retentions on one side, the just having been, and the protensions on the other side, the presently coming. And we can also go kind of one step higher, one step beyond that, if you like, to reflect on the experience of conscious acts themselves. That is to say, after the reduction. And we still have this sense of a kind of retention and protension and now structure, but with, like I said, it's just at a higher level. So now, to distinguish that, Husserl called them, instead of having been, the having been perceived, and instead of presently coming, about to be perceived. So there's the same idea, that same kind of structure, just at this higher level. But there was more to it than that. We could turn our gaze to the modification of reflection itself, the modification that reflection brings about for us in consciousness. We can focus on the intentionality in the experiences. So just a completely different range of objects, which nevertheless manifest similar traits, they have similar characteristics as to what we saw in the natural world, but just at this higher level. And so there are some parallels, but there are some additional features as well. And the second part of the video was the pure ego. And reflection from the natural standpoint here reveals that psychological ego subject, the I as the person. Whereas reflection after the reduction reveals the pure ego. And so the form of the ego, what the pure ego is the form of the cogito, I should say. And this pure subject, this orientation of the field of consciousness around a particular focal point. And it's similar to the ego subject of the natural standpoint, but again at this kind of higher level, just moving beyond that. Similar, not the same. And one of the biggest differences is that the pure ego is empty of content. So there is it's just, it manifests in its relations to the objects, in the way that the objects now point, if you like, to or make sense in relation from this locus of that's kind of sprung up in the field of consciousness. But of course it springs up, but it's always there. There is no moment in which there is no pure ego attached. Yeah. So hopefully that is clear. This is good. I think those were the first two structures of pure consciousness that Husserl talks about. He goes on to talk about phenomenological time and time consciousness, and that's a massive. I ended up writing way too much on that, so that's why I broke it up into two videos. And the fourth structure is intentionality, and that's also really interesting. So we'll table those two topics for discussion next week. And so that's where I'm going to wrap up today. Thanks for listening, as always, and I'll catch you in the next video.